Sometimes the person who irritates you the most is quietly protecting the parts of your life you never noticed were fragile. Ryan Walker had repeated the same complaint to anyone willing to listen for almost a year. Apartment 4B was occupied by the most annoyingly responsible man he had ever met. Ethan Hayes was 8 years older, impossibly organized, and somehow always aware of everything happening inside the small apartment building on the quiet outskirts of Portland, Oregon. If Ryan accidentally left his bicycle blocking the hallway, Ethan would politely remind him before the building manager ever noticed. If Ryan forgot to collect a package from the lobby, Ethan would knock on his door and tell him before someone else could mistake it for abandoned mail. If Ryan played music too loudly while cleaning on Saturday mornings, Ethan would wait until the song ended before gently asking if he could lower the volume because an elderly neighbor downstairs liked to sleep in after long hospital shifts. Ryan found it unbelievably frustrating. In his mind, Ethan acted less like a neighbor and more like an unpaid building supervisor. Whenever their paths crossed in the hallway, Ryan always expected another reminder about something he had forgotten. It became such a routine that he started rolling his eyes the moment he heard Ethan's calm footsteps outside his apartment. Their conversations rarely lasted longer than a minute. Ethan always spoke with quiet patience, never raising his voice, never sounding angry, and somehow that calmness irritated Ryan even more. He wanted the older man to lose his temper just once so he could prove Ethan was every bit as controlling as he seemed. Instead, Ethan simply smiled politely, wished him a good day, and returned to apartment 4B. Ryan often joked with coworkers that his neighbor probably had a checklist for everyone in the building. Secretly, however, even he had to admit one strange fact. Ethan never complained about anything that did not genuinely affect someone's safety or comfort. He never criticized Ryan's clothes, his late-night video games, or the stack of sketchbooks scattered around his living room. It was always the practical things. Lock your front door before bed. Bring an umbrella because the weather forecast had changed. Pick up your package before the leasing office closed. Ryan dismissed it all as unnecessary interference. One Thursday evening, dark clouds gathered much earlier than expected. By the time Ryan finished his shift at the local graphic design studio, rain hammered the city with surprising force. Streets shimmered beneath flashing traffic lights, while thunder rolled softly above the skyline. Ryan sprinted from his car to the apartment entrance with his backpack pulled over his head, laughing at his own terrible decision to leave his umbrella at home. Water soaked through his jacket within seconds. He climbed the stairs 2 at a time, eager for a hot shower, only to freeze outside his apartment door. His hands searched every pocket once, then twice, then again with growing panic. His keys were gone. Ryan stared at the locked door while rainwater dripped from his hair onto the hallway floor. He replayed the entire afternoon in his mind, but could not remember where he had last seen them. His phone battery had already dropped below 2% after a long workday, and the leasing office had closed more than an hour earlier. The hallway suddenly felt much colder than before. As he leaned against the wall with a frustrated sigh, a familiar apartment door slowly opened across the hall. Ethan stepped into the hallway carrying a small grocery bag, paused after seeing Ryan standing there completely soaked, and quietly took in the situation without saying a single word. For the first time since moving into the building, Ryan found himself hoping the one neighbor he had spent months trying to avoid might be the only person who could help him. Ryan expected another lecture. Instead, Ethan looked at the soaked young man for only a moment before quietly asking, "Did you lose your keys?" Ryan let out an embarrassed sigh and rubbed the back of his neck. Either that or they decided to disappear at the worst possible time. Ethan nodded as though this were the most ordinary problem in the world. "Come inside before you catch a cold. We can figure everything out afterward." Ryan instinctively opened his mouth to refuse. Pride told him accepting help from the one neighbor he constantly complained about was a terrible idea. Another crash of thunder echoed outside the building, and cold rainwater continued dripping from the sleeves of his jacket onto the hallway floor. His phone screen flashed 1% before turning completely black. He finally gave a reluctant nod. Ethan stepped aside without another word. The apartment across the hall looked nothing like Ryan had imagined. Instead of spotless perfection or stiff furniture, the space felt warm, welcoming, and comfortably lived in. Soft yellow lights reflected against wooden bookshelves filled with novels, travel guides, and old family photo albums. Several healthy green plants rested near wide windows where raindrops slowly traced patterns down the glass. A faint scent of cinnamon and freshly brewed tea lingered in the air, replacing the cold smell of wet concrete from the hallway. Ethan disappeared briefly into another room before returning with a clean towel and a folded gray sweatshirt. "Your jacket is soaked," he said gently. "You can borrow this while your clothes dry." Ryan accepted them awkwardly. "You really do not have to do all this." Ethan smiled with quiet patience. "I know. I want to." Those 4 words caught Ryan completely off guard. There was no trace of obligation or annoyance in Ethan's voice, only simple kindness delivered without expectation. After changing into the dry sweatshirt, Ryan noticed it fit slightly loose across his shoulders. It carried the comforting scent of cedar and laundry detergent, making him feel strangely at ease inside an apartment that had always seemed mysterious from the outside. Ethan soon returned from the kitchen carrying 2 large ceramic mugs filled with steaming herbal tea. He placed one carefully on the coffee table before sitting in an armchair across from the couch instead of beside Ryan, giving him plenty of personal space. Rain continued tapping softly against the windows while distant thunder faded farther into the night. For several quiet minutes, neither of them spoke. Ryan wrapped both hands around the warm mug, grateful for the heat slowly returning to his fingers. Eventually, his curiosity became stronger than his discomfort. His eyes wandered across the bookshelves until they stopped on several framed photographs. One showed Ethan standing beside an older couple in front of a mountain cabin. Another captured him laughing with what looked like college friends during a camping trip. There were no expensive decorations or signs of luxury, only memories carefully preserved throughout the apartment. "I thought your place would look." Ryan hesitated, searching for the right word. Ethan raised an amused eyebrow. "More boring." Ryan laughed despite himself. "Maybe a little." Ethan chuckled quietly, the sound warm enough to erase much of the awkwardness between them. "I get that more often than you might think." Ryan studied the older man for a moment. For the first time since moving into the building, he realized Ethan did not seem controlling at all. He seemed calm, patient, someone who preferred solving problems instead of arguing about them. Outside, the rain continued falling without mercy, but inside apartment 4B the storm no longer felt nearly as cold, and Ryan found himself wondering whether he had spent the past year misunderstanding the man living just across the hallway. The leasing office did not reopen until 8 o'clock the next morning, so Ryan ended up staying in Ethan's apartment far longer than either of them had expected. The storm outside showed no sign of ending. Rain continued drumming softly against the windows, while the warm scent of herbal tea slowly filled every corner of the living room. Ethan disappeared into the kitchen once again and returned carrying 2 bowls of homemade tomato soup with slices of toasted sourdough bread resting on a wooden board between them. Ryan stared at the meal with genuine surprise. "You were planning to cook all this just for yourself?" Ethan smiled as he placed the bowls on the coffee table. "I usually make enough for 2 or 3 meals. It saves time during the week." Ryan laughed quietly. "You really have thought of everything." Ethan shrugged with an easy smile. "Not everything. I still lose my reading glasses almost every day." The simple joke made Ryan laugh much harder than he expected. It was the first completely relaxed conversation they had ever shared. As dinner continued, they talked about ordinary things instead of hallway reminders and forgotten packages. Ryan spoke about working as a graphic designer, explaining how he loved creating logos and illustrations even though deadlines often kept him at the office late into the evening. Ethan admitted he worked as a physical therapist at a rehabilitation clinic, helping patients recover from injuries one careful step at a time. "That explains a lot," Ryan said thoughtfully. Ethan looked up from his soup. "What does?" Ryan smiled awkwardly. "You always notice little things. Whether someone looks tired, whether an elderly neighbor is carrying groceries that are too heavy, whether I forgot my umbrella." Ethan stirred his tea for a moment before answering. "When you spend every day helping people recover, paying attention becomes a habit." His voice remained calm, without any hint of pride. Ryan found himself studying the older man more closely. Everything inside the apartment reflected the same quiet personality. There were hiking boots neatly placed beside the front door, shelves filled with novels that had folded corners instead of untouched spines, family photographs capturing birthdays, camping trips, and ordinary smiles, and several healthy houseplants growing toward the soft light near the windows. Nothing felt staged or perfect. It simply felt lived in. At one point, Ryan noticed a small wooden birdhouse resting on a shelf beside the books. "Did you buy that?" he asked. Ethan shook his head. "My father built it years ago. He always believed every home should have something made with love instead of money." Ryan nodded slowly, unable to explain why that sentence stayed with him. Outside, the storm finally began to weaken, leaving only a gentle rhythm of rain against the glass. When Ethan glanced at the clock, it was already well past midnight. "You can take the couch," he said kindly. "I have extra blankets in the closet. The building manager can unlock your apartment first thing tomorrow morning." Ryan hesitated before answering, "Thank you for everything." Ethan smiled with the same quiet warmth Ryan had completely misunderstood for nearly a year. Neighbors are supposed to help each other. That has always seemed pretty simple to me. Long after Ethan disappeared into his bedroom, Ryan remained awake beneath the soft blanket, listening to the peaceful silence inside apartment 4B. For months he had convinced himself the older man across the hallway was judgmental and impossible to please. Yet the person he had met tonight was patient, thoughtful, and unexpectedly kind. As the last drops of rain slid down the window, Ryan realized something had quietly shifted inside him. Ethan had not changed at all. The only thing changing was the way Ryan had finally begun to see him. The next morning, sunlight poured through the apartment windows as though the storm had never happened. Ryan thanked the building manager after finally unlocking his apartment, returned Ethan's sweatshirt neatly folded, and apologized once again for disrupting his evening. Ethan simply smiled and wished him a good day before heading to work with the same calm expression he always carried. Ryan expected everything to return to normal after that, but something had quietly changed. The hallway no longer felt like a place where he hurried past apartment 4B without looking. Instead, he found himself paying attention to small moments he had ignored for months. One Tuesday morning, he stepped outside just as Ethan was locking his door. "Good morning," Ethan said with an easy smile. Ryan answered almost automatically before realizing it was the first genuine greeting they had ever exchanged. As they walked toward the parking lot together, Ethan glanced at the cloudy sky and said, "You might want to bring an umbrella today. They are predicting another storm this afternoon." Ryan almost laughed because only a week earlier that comment would have annoyed him. Instead, he walked back upstairs, grabbed the umbrella hanging beside his front door, and silently admitted Ethan had probably saved him from another miserable walk through the rain. Later that evening, Ryan returned home carrying several grocery bags after stopping at the supermarket. Before he could reach his apartment door, one of the paper bags suddenly tore open, sending apples, pasta, and canned soup rolling across the hallway floor. Ryan sighed in frustration and knelt to gather everything before noticing another pair of hands quietly helping him. Ethan picked up the last few items without making a single joke or unnecessary comment. "I should probably start buying reusable bags," Ryan said with an embarrassed smile. Ethan nodded. "They are stronger and they last longer." Ryan laughed. "That sounds exactly like something you would say." Ethan looked mildly confused before smiling himself. "Probably." They carried the groceries inside Ryan's apartment together, where Ethan noticed several unopened delivery boxes stacked beside the couch. "Busy week?" he asked. Ryan nodded while putting food away. "A client moved up a deadline. I have barely been home." Ethan quietly placed a container on the kitchen counter before leaving. "I made extra vegetable lasagna yesterday. Heat it up if you do not have time to cook tonight." Ryan looked down at the neatly labeled container after the apartment door closed. There was no note asking for anything in return, no reminder, no lecture about eating healthier. Just dinner. Similar moments slowly became part of everyday life. If Ryan worked late, he occasionally found homemade soup or fresh muffins outside his door with a simple handwritten message that read, "Made too much." When Ethan noticed Ryan struggling to carry heavy art supplies upstairs, he wordlessly grabbed one end of the box and helped without waiting to be asked. Ryan began doing small things in return. He watered Ethan's plants during long work days, picked up groceries whenever he stopped at the store, and once surprised Ethan with fresh coffee before an early morning shift at the rehabilitation clinic. Neither of them mentioned how naturally these quiet routines had developed. They simply happened. Weeks passed, and Ryan realized something that would have seemed impossible only a month earlier. Ethan had never become less attentive. He still reminded Ryan to lock his door before vacations, still noticed when packages sat too long in the lobby, and still warned everyone about approaching storms. The difference was that Ryan no longer heard criticism inside those words. For the first time, he recognized them for what they had always been. Someone quietly making sure the people around him arrived home safely every single day. Autumn arrived quietly, painting the trees surrounding the apartment building in shades of amber and gold, and life settled into a rhythm Ryan had never expected to enjoy. Some mornings he and Ethan left for work at exactly the same time, sharing a short walk to the parking lot before heading in different directions. Other evenings they crossed paths while bringing groceries upstairs or collecting packages from the lobby, and what had once been awkward conversations slowly became easy exchanges about books, favorite restaurants, or funny stories from work. Ryan found himself looking forward to those small moments more than he cared to admit. Then, one Monday morning, Ethan's apartment door remained closed. Ryan assumed he had simply left early. Tuesday passed the same way. By Wednesday evening, apartment 4B was still silent. No footsteps in the hallway. No calm voice reminding someone about an incoming delivery. No homemade soup appearing outside Ryan's door after another late shift. The hallway felt strangely empty. On Thursday, Ryan finally stopped by the leasing office to ask if Ethan was all right. The building manager looked up from her paperwork and smiled. "Oh, Ethan?" He accepted a temporary assignment through the rehabilitation clinic. They needed someone to help at a partner facility in Seattle for 2 weeks. Ryan blinked. 2 weeks. She nodded. He left early Monday morning. He mentioned the schedule came together pretty quickly. Ryan thanked her and walked back upstairs, surprised by the heaviness settling somewhere inside his chest. That evening he unlocked his apartment, switched on the lights, and stood in the quiet kitchen longer than usual. He reached automatically toward the refrigerator before remembering there would not be another container of homemade leftovers waiting there this week. He laughed softly at himself, almost embarrassed by how quickly he had grown accustomed to Ethan's quiet kindness. The following days only made the silence more noticeable. One afternoon, Ryan struggled to carry several large presentation boards up the stairs after an important client meeting. Halfway to the 3rd floor, he instinctively paused, almost expecting Ethan to appear and grab one side, without saying a word. No one came. On Friday morning, dark clouds gathered again above Portland. Ryan reached for his keys before suddenly turning back toward the coat rack to grab an umbrella. He smiled as he realized he had heard Ethan's familiar reminder inside his own thoughts. At work, his coworkers noticed he seemed unusually distracted. During lunch, one of them joked, "You look like your favorite television show got canceled." Ryan laughed politely, but could not explain the truth. He did not miss entertainment. He missed ordinary conversations in apartment hallways, cups of tea after long days, and someone who always seemed to notice the little things everyone else overlooked. Saturday afternoon, he watered the small plant Ethan had asked him to watch before leaving town. As he stood inside apartment 4B surrounded by familiar bookshelves, photographs, and healthy green plants, Ryan noticed a framed picture of Ethan standing beside an older woman with the same gentle smile. Before he could wonder who she was, the building manager knocked softly on the open door to drop off a package. She noticed Ryan looking at the photograph and said quietly, "That is Ethan's mother. He lost her several years ago after a medical emergency. Ever since then, he checks on everyone around him because he never wants another person to go through something alone without someone noticing." Ryan looked back at the photograph in silence. In a single sentence, every reminder, every knock on his door, every quiet act of kindness suddenly carried an entirely different meaning. Ethan had never been trying to control anyone. He had simply been making sure the people around him always made it safely home. 2 weeks passed more slowly than Ryan ever imagined possible. Every evening, he found himself listening for familiar footsteps in the hallway. Before remembering apartment 4B was still empty. The silence no longer felt peaceful. It felt unfinished. Then, on a chilly Friday evening, dark clouds gathered above Portland once again. Rain began falling just after sunset, covering the sidewalks with shimmering reflections that reminded Ryan of the night everything had quietly changed between them. He had just returned from work when he noticed headlights pulling into Ethan's usual parking space. Before he could think twice, Ryan was already opening his apartment door. Across the hallway, Ethan stepped out of his car carrying a travel bag over one shoulder and a small paper sack in his hand. He looked pleasantly surprised to see Ryan standing there. "You are back," Ryan said, realizing how obvious those words sounded the moment they left his mouth. Ethan smiled with the same calm warmth Ryan had come to miss. "I am." The assignment ended earlier than expected. For a brief second, neither of them moved. Rain tapped gently against the building's entrance while the hallway remained comfortably quiet. Ethan lifted the paper sack with a faint laugh. "I brought back coffee from a little place near the clinic. I remembered you liked darker roasts." Ryan stared at the bag before looking back at Ethan. Even after spending 2 demanding weeks hundreds of miles away, Ethan had still remembered something as small as his favorite coffee. Ryan felt his throat tighten with emotion he could no longer explain away as gratitude. "Can we talk?" he asked softly. Ethan nodded without hesitation and unlocked his apartment door. Minutes later, they sat in the familiar living room where everything had begun on that rainy night. The scent of fresh coffee replaced the herbal tea from weeks before, yet the room carried the same quiet comfort Ryan now associated with Ethan. He looked around at the bookshelves, the plants, the framed photographs, and finally at the man sitting across from him. "I owe you an apology," Ryan began. Ethan tilted his head slightly. "For what?" Ryan took a slow breath. "For almost a year, I thought you were trying to tell everyone how to live. I rolled my eyes every time you knocked on my door. I complained about you to my coworkers. I convinced myself you were controlling." Ethan listened without interrupting. "Then I found out why you always noticed the little things," Ryan continued quietly. "The building manager told me about your mother." Ethan lowered his eyes for a moment before giving a small nod. "I never wanted people to know because I did not want sympathy." Ryan's voice softened even more. "It was never about sympathy. It made me understand you. Every reminder, every package, every umbrella, every meal. You were never trying to control anyone. You were trying to make sure no one felt alone." Ethan remained silent for several seconds before speaking. "After losing someone you love, you start noticing how quickly ordinary days can change. If I can make someone's day a little safer or a little easier, it feels worth doing." Ryan smiled through the emotion filling his chest. "I used to think your knocks on my door were the most annoying part of my day." He paused before meeting Ethan's gentle eyes again. "Now I think they were the kindest thing anyone has done for me in a very long time." Outside, rain continued falling against the windows just as it had on the night they first shared tea together, but this time neither of them heard a storm. They heard the quiet beginning of something that neither one had expected to find just across the hallway. The days following that conversation unfolded with a quiet ease neither Ryan nor Ethan tried to explain. Nothing dramatic changed overnight, yet everything somehow felt different. The hallway between apartments 4A and 4B no longer seemed like empty space separating two neighbors. It became the place where every morning started with a cheerful greeting and every evening ended with an unspoken certainty that someone was nearby. Ryan noticed himself listening for Ethan's footsteps again, but this time with anticipation instead of irritation. One Saturday morning, Ethan knocked gently on Ryan's door, holding 2 paper cups of coffee and wearing the familiar calm smile Ryan had come to appreciate. "There is a farmer's market downtown today," Ethan said. "I was planning to stop by before buying groceries. Would you like to come?" Ryan accepted before thinking of an excuse, surprising himself almost as much as Ethan. They spent the morning wandering between colorful produce stands, fresh flowers, handmade bread, and local artists selling paintings beneath white tents. Ethan greeted several vendors by name, asking about their families and complimenting a baker on a new recipe he had tried the previous weekend. Ryan watched quietly, realizing Ethan treated complete strangers with the same patience and kindness he showed everyone in the apartment building. Nothing about it was an act. It was simply who he was. As they walked toward the parking lot carrying reusable shopping bags filled with vegetables and fresh pastries, Ryan smiled. "You know almost everyone here." Ethan laughed softly. "I come every Saturday. It is easier to support local businesses than large supermarkets when I can." Ryan shook his head with amused disbelief. "You somehow make even grocery shopping sound thoughtful." Ethan looked slightly embarrassed before changing the subject by pointing toward a small flower stand. A bucket of bright yellow sunflowers caught his attention. He purchased a simple bouquet and noticed Ryan watching curiously. "For your apartment?" Ryan asked. Ethan smiled, and shook his head. For Mrs. Bennet downstairs. She mentioned this week would have been her wedding anniversary. I thought they might brighten her living room a little. Ryan fell silent. Another ordinary gesture. Another reminder that Ethan noticed things most people overlooked. Later that afternoon, they cooked lunch together in Ethan's apartment, laughing over Ryan's clumsy attempts to slice vegetables evenly, while Ethan patiently demonstrated better techniques. Their conversation drifted naturally from favorite childhood memories to dream vacations and books they loved. At one point, Ryan admitted he had started reading one of the novels Ethan had recommended weeks earlier. Ethan's eyes lit up with genuine excitement. "What do you think so far?" Ryan smiled. "I finally understand why you kept telling me to finish the first 3 chapters before judging it." Ethan laughed. "Some stories need time before they reveal who they really are." Ryan looked at him for a long moment before quietly replying, "So do some people." Ethan's smile faded into thoughtful silence as those words settled gently between them. Neither of them rushed to fill the quiet that followed. Outside, soft afternoon sunlight filtered through the apartment windows, illuminating the bookshelves, the green plants, and the small wooden birdhouse Ethan's father had built years before. Ryan suddenly realized this apartment no longer felt like someone else's home. It felt familiar, comforting, and strangely important to him. As they washed the dishes together after lunch, Ryan caught himself smiling for no particular reason. Somewhere between a rainy night, countless small acts of kindness, and one ordinary trip to the farmer's market, the older neighbor he had once tried so hard to avoid had quietly become the favorite part of his everyday life. As October slowly gave way to November, the apartment building settled into the comfortable rhythm of cooler mornings, shorter days, and evenings scented with rain drifting through open hallway windows. Ryan could no longer remember the last time he had walked past apartment 4B without stopping to knock. Sometimes it was to return a borrowed book. Sometimes it was simply because he had picked up an extra coffee on the way home from work. The reasons became less important than the conversations that followed. One Friday evening, Ethan invited Ryan onto the rooftop terrace after dinner, where a few wooden benches overlooked the quiet streets of Portland. The city lights shimmered beneath low clouds while a gentle breeze carried the scent of damp pavement after another afternoon shower. They sat together in comfortable silence, each holding a warm cup of coffee, watching headlights drift through the distance below. Ryan smiled softly. "You know, a few months ago I would have avoided sitting here with you." Ethan laughed quietly. "I noticed." Ryan rubbed the back of his neck with an embarrassed grin. "Was I really that obvious?" Ethan looked toward the skyline before answering. "You always walked a little faster whenever you saw me." Ryan could not help laughing. "I thought you were going to remind me about something every single time." Ethan smiled with the familiar patience Ryan now understood so well. "Sometimes I probably did." They both laughed together, and the easy sound lingered in the cool evening air. After a long pause, Ryan looked down at the coffee in his hands. "Can I ask you something?" Ethan nodded. "Anything." Ryan hesitated before speaking. "Why did you never stop being kind to me?" Ethan seemed genuinely surprised by the question. "Because you never gave me a reason to stop." Ryan looked at him in disbelief. "I complained about you. I rolled my eyes every time you knocked on my door. I was not exactly welcoming." Ethan's smile remained gentle. "No, you were busy. You were stressed. Sometimes people protect themselves by pushing others away. That does not make them bad people." Ryan stared quietly at the older man, realizing once again that Ethan somehow managed to see the best in people even when they struggled to see it themselves. A light rain began falling, barely more than a mist, and neither of them rushed to leave. Ryan closed his eyes for a moment, letting the cool air settle around him before speaking with complete honesty. "When you went to Seattle, I kept expecting the hallway to feel normal again." Ethan listened carefully. Ryan smiled to himself. Instead, it felt empty. The words hung gently between them. Ethan lowered his cup onto the bench beside him. Ryan continued before his courage disappeared. "I thought I missed having a good neighbor. Then I realized I was missing you." Ethan's expression softened with quiet emotion. For the first time since they had met, the older man seemed unsure what to say. Ryan laughed softly at his own nervousness. "I know this probably sounds unexpected, especially after the way I acted when we first met. But somewhere between that rainy night, your terrible herbal tea, your constant reminders to carry an umbrella, And all those ordinary days that somehow became my favorite memories, I stopped seeing you as the neighbor who annoyed me. He looked directly into Ethan's warm eyes, smiling with calm certainty. I started seeing you as the person I hope is on the other side of the hallway every time I come home. Ethan's quiet smile slowly returned, brighter than Ryan had ever seen before. And in that simple moment, both of them understood that the distance between two neighboring apartments had quietly become the shortest path either of them had ever taken toward finding home. Winter arrived gently, wrapping Portland in crisp mornings and soft gray skies that made every apartment window glow a little warmer after sunset. Nearly a year had passed since the rainy evening that first brought Ryan into apartment 4B, and life had quietly settled into a rhythm neither he nor Ethan would have imagined possible. Every weekday morning they left the building together, carrying matching travel mugs of coffee. Ryan still forgot his umbrella from time to time, although much less often than before, and Ethan still smiled while holding one out before they reached the parking lot. The difference was that Ryan no longer pretended to be annoyed. Instead, he accepted it with a grateful smile that always made Ethan laugh. Their neighbors quickly noticed the change. Mrs. Bennett downstairs often joked that the hallway had become much quieter because the two men no longer exchanged polite greetings from opposite doorways. Instead, they stood talking for several minutes before leaving for work, discussing everything from new books and favorite recipes to Ryan's latest design project or one of Ethan's patients reaching an important milestone in recovery. The apartment building itself seemed somehow warmer because of those ordinary conversations. One Saturday afternoon, Ryan unlocked the door to his own apartment after returning from a weekend art fair. He stood silently in the middle of the living room, looking around at the familiar furniture, sketchbooks, and half-finished illustrations spread across his desk. The space that had once felt perfectly comfortable now seemed strangely incomplete. A gentle knock sounded on the door only seconds later. Ryan smiled before opening it because he already knew who it would be. Ethan stood there holding 2 bowls of homemade chili and a loaf of freshly baked bread. "I made too much again," he said with the same familiar excuse that had long since stopped fooling either of them. Ryan laughed softly. "You always make too much." Ethan shrugged with playful innocence. "It keeps happening." Ryan stepped aside to let him in, but instead of walking toward the kitchen, he quietly closed the apartment door behind them. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. Ryan looked around the room once more before turning back toward Ethan with a thoughtful smile. "Can I ask you something?" Ethan nodded. "Of course." Ryan took a slow breath. "Do you ever get tired of walking across the hallway every day?" Ethan blinked in confusion before answering honestly. "Not really." "Why?" Ryan smiled, his eyes reflecting the quiet certainty that had grown stronger through countless ordinary moments shared together. "Because I think we have spent an entire year proving something." Ethan waited patiently. Ryan laughed softly. "We keep making dinner for 2. We keep borrowing books that never really leave the other apartment. We keep watching movies together until one of us falls asleep on the couch. We spend more time deciding whose place to eat than actually eating." Ethan's gentle smile slowly widened as he began to understand. Ryan took one small step closer. "Maybe the hallway has done its job." Ethan looked at him with warmth that needed no dramatic words to be understood. "What are you saying?" Ryan reached for Ethan's hand naturally, the gesture feeling as ordinary as every quiet act of kindness that had brought them to this moment. "I am saying that home has never really been apartment 4A or apartment 4B. He smiled with peaceful confidence. "Home has been wherever you happen to be. So maybe it is finally time we stopped living across the hallway from each other and started living the life we have already been building all along." Ethan's eyes filled with quiet happiness before he answered with the same calm certainty that had always defined him. "I was hoping you would say that someday." Outside, light snow began falling over the apartment building, covering the familiar sidewalk where so many ordinary days had quietly become the beginning of an extraordinary love story built not on grand gestures, but on patience, kindness, and the simple decision to keep knocking on the right door. Spring returned to Portland with clear skies, flowering trees, and longer evenings that invited neighbors to linger outside just a little longer before heading indoors. Ryan and Ethan no longer thought of themselves as 2 people living across a hallway. After weeks of carefully packing boxes, reorganizing furniture, and deciding which books belonged on which shelves, apartment 4B quietly became their shared home. Ryan joked that the moving process had been surprisingly simple because most of his belongings had already been scattered throughout Ethan's apartment anyway. Ethan smiled every time he heard that, secretly knowing it was true. The first morning they officially woke up under the same roof felt almost identical to every morning before, yet somehow completely different. Ethan prepared coffee while Ryan toasted bread and searched for the strawberry jam that somehow disappeared every time they reorganized the kitchen. They laughed as they opened the wrong cabinets one after another before finally remembering where everything had been placed. Nothing about the morning was remarkable, yet Ryan found himself smiling for the entire drive to work simply because ordinary routines somehow felt brighter when they were shared. Their neighbors quickly adjusted to the new arrangement. Mrs. Bennett downstairs happily announced that she had predicted this outcome months earlier, while the building manager smiled every time she saw them collecting packages together instead of separately. One afternoon, she handed Ethan a small envelope that had arrived in the mail. Inside was a handwritten thank you card from one of his former rehabilitation patients. The message thanked Ethan for never giving up during months of difficult recovery and ended with one sentence that stayed with Ryan long after he accidentally read it, while Ethan laughed and passed him the card. The people who quietly believe in us often help us stand again before we even realize we are falling. That evening, while preparing dinner together, Ryan looked at Ethan across the kitchen island and realized those words described far more than physical healing. Ethan had patiently believed in him long before Ryan learned how to believe in someone else again. Later that week, the apartment building organized its annual spring courtyard gathering. Neighbors brought homemade desserts, folding chairs, and small string lights that transformed the shared outdoor space into a welcoming place filled with laughter and conversation. Ryan watched Ethan move naturally from one group to another, checking whether Mrs. Bennett needed help carrying her chair, making sure a young family had enough blankets for their children after sunset, and quietly fixing a loose patio light before anyone else even noticed it had stopped working. Ryan smiled to himself because he finally understood something important. Ethan had never reserved his kindness for one person. Caring for others was simply the way he moved through the world. When the evening ended and everyone returned to their apartments, Ryan and Ethan remained outside for a few extra minutes beneath the gentle glow of the courtyard lights. Ryan slipped his hands into his jacket pockets and laughed softly. "Do you remember how convinced I was that you were the most annoying person in this building?" Ethan raised an amused eyebrow. "I remember." Ryan looked toward the familiar hallway leading to their apartment. "Now I cannot imagine coming home without hearing your footsteps." Ethan smiled with quiet affection. "That is good, because I still plan to remind you whenever you forget your umbrella." Ryan laughed and gently shook his head. "Please do." They walked upstairs together, side by side, understanding that love had never arrived all at once. It had quietly grown through shared mornings, borrowed books, homemade meals, thoughtful reminders, and countless ordinary moments that slowly transformed two neighboring lives into one peaceful home. Summer settled gently over Portland, filling the apartment courtyard with blooming flowers, warm evenings, and the familiar sound of neighbors chatting outside after work. Ryan and Ethan had lived together for several months now, yet the greatest surprise was how little their daily routines had actually changed. They still woke early, shared coffee before leaving for work, stopped at the neighborhood grocery store together on Thursdays, and spent quiet Sunday afternoons reading side by side in the living room while soft music played in the background. Ryan often smiled to himself because the ordinary life he once believed would become boring had quietly become everything he had never realized he wanted. One Saturday morning, Ethan noticed a handwritten notice posted near the apartment mailboxes asking for volunteers to help repaint the community garden benches before the annual neighborhood picnic. Without hesitation, he wrote both of their names on the list. Ryan laughed when he saw it. "You volunteered me without asking." Ethan looked almost apologetic before smiling. "I thought you might enjoy it." Ryan pretended to sigh dramatically before taking the clipboard and writing his own name a second time beneath Ethan's. "Now I volunteered myself too." The following weekend, they spent the afternoon working alongside neighbors of every age. Ethan carefully sanded old wooden benches while Ryan painted them a bright forest green that matched the climbing vines surrounding the garden. Mrs. Bennett arrived carrying homemade lemonade for everyone. proudly announcing that she had always believed the apartment building felt more like a family than a collection of separate homes. Ryan looked around at the smiling faces gathered beneath the summer sun and realized she was right. Many of those friendships existed because Ethan had quietly spent years making sure people felt noticed, welcomed, and cared for. During a short break, Ryan wandered toward the small garden where butterflies drifted between colorful flowers. Ethan joined him carrying 2 glasses of lemonade. "You seem thoughtful," Ethan said. Ryan nodded slowly. "I was just remembering the first time you knocked on my door." Ethan laughed softly. "You looked like you wanted to pretend nobody was home." Ryan smiled with playful embarrassment. "Honestly, I probably did." They both laughed before Ryan's expression softened. "Back then I thought you were interrupting my life." He looked toward the freshly painted benches, where neighbors continued working together. "Now I realize you were quietly becoming part of it." Ethan remained silent for a moment before speaking with his usual gentle honesty. "I never expected anything in return. I only hoped one day you would understand that every reminder came from wanting people to be safe." Ryan reached over and lightly touched Ethan's hand. "I understand now." That evening they returned home tired from hours of painting, but strangely energized by the laughter they had shared with everyone in the courtyard. While preparing dinner together, Ryan opened a kitchen cabinet and smiled when he found 3 umbrellas neatly hanging beside the pantry door. Ethan noticed his amused expression. "Too many?" he asked. Ryan shook his head. "Not enough." Ethan looked confused until Ryan continued with a grin. "Now we need 1 more for guests." Ethan laughed warmly, the sound filling their apartment with the same quiet comfort Ryan had first discovered on that rainy night many months ago. Looking around the familiar living room filled with books, plants, photographs, and shared memories, Ryan realized that love had never changed who either of them was. Instead, it had simply given every ordinary habit, every thoughtful reminder, and every quiet act of kindness a place where it would always be appreciated, turning an apartment that once belonged to one careful neighbor into a home where 2 hearts finally understood the true meaning of belonging. Autumn returned almost without anyone noticing, carrying cool mornings, golden leaves, and the familiar sound of gentle rain tapping against the apartment windows. Another year had quietly passed, yet Ryan still smiled every time he heard Ethan reminding someone to be careful on the slippery front steps after a storm. Some habits never changed, and Ryan had come to believe that was one of life's greatest gifts. One Friday evening, after finishing work earlier than expected, Ryan stopped by a small bakery before walking home. He picked up Ethan's favorite cinnamon rolls, smiling as he remembered the older man pretending every single time that he only wanted half, while somehow finishing the larger piece anyway. When Ryan reached their apartment, he found Ethan sitting by the living room window reading a novel with a warm blanket draped across his shoulders while soft rain blurred the city lights outside. The peaceful scene made Ryan pause for a moment before quietly stepping inside. Ethan looked up with the familiar smile that had greeted him almost every day for the past 2 years. "You are home early," he said. Ryan placed the bakery box on the coffee table. "I thought we deserved a quiet evening." Ethan opened the box, laughed when he saw the cinnamon rolls, and looked at Ryan with playful amusement. "You remembered." Ryan smiled. "I learned from the best. You never forget the little things." They spent the evening exactly the way they liked most. Warm coffee, homemade soup, favorite books resting unopened beside them because conversation became more interesting than reading, and rain gently falling beyond the windows. At one point, Ryan noticed Ethan looking thoughtfully toward the hallway outside their apartment. "What are you thinking about?" Ryan asked. Ethan smiled softly. "The first time I knocked on your door." Ryan laughed immediately. "I almost did not answer." Ethan nodded with quiet amusement. "I know." Ryan leaned back against the couch, shaking his head. "It is strange. I spent months believing every knock meant another reminder about something I forgot." Ethan looked at him warmly. "And now?" Ryan glanced toward the apartment door before answering. "Now every time I hear someone knock, I still hope it is you." Silence settled comfortably between them. Not the awkward silence of strangers, but the peaceful quiet shared only by people who understood each other without needing many words. Ethan reached for Ryan's hand naturally, and Ryan realized that gesture now felt as ordinary as making morning coffee or watering the plants together every Sunday. Later that evening, they decided to take a short walk despite the light rain. Umbrellas opened above them as they wandered through the familiar neighborhood, where trees glowed beneath streetlights reflecting off wet sidewalks. Passing their apartment building, Ryan noticed a young man struggling to carry several heavy moving boxes toward an empty unit on the first floor. Without hesitation, Ethan walked over and offered to help. Ryan smiled before lifting another box himself. The new neighbor thanked them repeatedly, surprised by such unexpected kindness. As they finished carrying the final box inside, Ethan simply smiled and welcomed him to the building. Walking back toward their own apartment, Ryan quietly slipped his hand into Ethan's again. "You are doing it already," he said with a gentle laugh. Ethan looked confused. "Doing what?" Ryan smiled toward the warmly lit building entrance where another ordinary story was just beginning. "Knocking on someone else's door before they even realized they might need a friend." Ethan laughed softly, and together they walked home through the gentle autumn rain, understanding that the smallest acts of kindness often become the beginning of the greatest changes, even when nobody notices them at first. 5 years slipped by with the quiet certainty of changing seasons, and the apartment building where everything began still welcomed every rainy evening with the same familiar warmth. New neighbors had moved in, children who once played in the courtyard had grown taller, and fresh flowers continued blooming outside the entrance every spring because someone always remembered to care for them. Ryan and Ethan remained exactly where life had first brought them together, although their home now carried the comfortable feeling of years filled with shared memories instead of separate routines. Every morning still began with coffee prepared together, and every evening still ended with books resting on the living room table while soft music drifted through the apartment. Some people searched the world for extraordinary adventures. Ryan had discovered that the most meaningful adventure was learning to appreciate ordinary days beside the right person. One rainy Saturday afternoon, Ryan opened a hallway closet looking for an old toolbox and noticed the gray sweatshirt Ethan had lent him years earlier on the night he lost his keys. He smiled as he held the familiar fabric in his hands. Ethan walked into the room carrying 2 mugs of coffee and laughed softly. "You still have not given that back." Ryan looked at him with playful innocence. "I think the return policy expired a long time ago." Ethan shook his head with a warm smile. "You are probably right." Ryan folded the sweatshirt carefully before placing it back on the shelf. Funny how one ordinary piece of clothing can remind you that your whole life changed because of one rainy evening. Ethan stepped closer and looked toward the apartment door where everything had quietly begun years before. "It was never really about the rain," he said gently. "It was about someone finally deciding to open a door." Those simple words settled deep inside Ryan's heart. Later that evening, they walked through the apartment courtyard carrying umbrellas while light rain shimmered beneath the streetlights. The newest resident of the building stood near the entrance looking frustrated while searching every pocket for something that clearly was not there. Ryan immediately recognized the worried expression because he had worn it once himself. Before the young neighbor could say anything, Ethan smiled kindly and asked, "Did you happen to misplace your keys?" Ryan laughed quietly beside him, amazed at how perfectly history sometimes repeated itself. The young man nodded with embarrassed relief. Ethan invited him inside to wait until the emergency locksmith arrived, offering a warm towel and a hot cup of tea exactly as he had done years earlier. Ryan watched the entire scene unfold with grateful eyes before quietly following them inside, carrying an extra blanket from the hallway closet. As the evening continued, he realized he was no longer the impatient young man who believed kindness was unnecessary interference. He had become someone who naturally reached for another cup, another chair, another small gesture that might help a stranger feel welcome. Looking across the living room, Ryan caught Ethan smiling at him with unmistakable pride. No words were needed because they both understood the lesson life had patiently taught them. The greatest love stories rarely begin with perfect timing or dramatic moments. They begin with ordinary people choosing compassion one small act at a time until kindness becomes trust, trust becomes friendship, friendship becomes home, and one simple knock on the right door changes 2 lives forever. As rain continued falling gently outside, Ryan smiled, knowing that every time someone knocked in the future, he would always remember the evening he finally opened not only a door, but also his heart.